Okay, everybody, welcome to Chapter 16, which is Gothic art of the 12th and 13th centuries. I'm giving you a little bit of a broader set of dates of Gothic, just to give you a better idea of what the period really entails. We have a very specific starting point for Gothic, which is 1140, which I'll discuss. And then it really does continue till about 1500, when we really start to see the Renaissance take over in all of Europe. Gothic, like Romanesque, has quite a few similarities. It is not a specific culture we're talking about. We're talking about a period in time. Romanesque actually used to just be called early Gothic, so in many ways it's a continuation of the ideas that we've seen in Gothic, both in Romanesque, both in terms of the culture and in terms of the architecture. And like Romanesque, the term Gothic was a negative term that was assigned to it. It was actually given that title in the 16th century, and Gothic was meant to refer to the Goths, which were the Germanic invaders who destroyed, or who conquered, really, the Western Roman Empire. And so when something was called Gothic, it was meant to mean that it was of the style that was anti-classical. In other words, it was the style that destroyed the good Roman style before the return of the Renaissance. So it's not a positive term. For us, what we're really going to see it as is a period where we see the Romanesque city, small towns, let's say, that began to emerge in Romanesque, become the Gothic city. So we have the rise of much larger cities centered around universities. We've got the birth of a lot of the modern states in the Gothic period, so Europe begins to be more organized the way that we know it now. Gothic flourishes throughout Europe, but to a greater or lesser extent depending on where you are. So whereas Italy really saw Romanesque that looked a lot like Roman art, Gothic is not going to be as strong in Italy, where they sort of maintain that sort of classicizing Roman bent. Whereas north of the Alps, especially in France and Germany, Gothic truly flourishes. And now you're going to see that I'm going to spend most of my time for this class in France, where is the first place we see the emergence of Gothic, and it has some of the most characteristic Gothic buildings that are going to allow us to discuss the entire period. It is a prosperous period. It's also a tumultuous period, especially late Gothic. When we get the 100 Years' War, we get the plague in the 14th century. We also get the Great Schism of the Church, where the Catholic Church gets divided. So many crises, but also a tremendous amount of growth of wealth in terms of the cities and in terms of the church that allow for building projects on a new scale. A lot of these building projects, interestingly enough, were spurred on by fire. Despite the fact that Romanesque involved a lot of stone construction, a lot of them still used timber frames over the stone vaulting in the roofs, and a lot of early churches burn over time, and so we get new churches that are built, and with the same motives in terms of wanting to attract pilgrims and visitors, which now brought money into the cities. So here's where we are. Okay, we're still in Europe. This is actually just showing you the growth of France, right, and the French royal domain, which, as I said, we're getting the rise of city-states as we know them now, or states as we know them now. We're really going to be focused right around Paris. I mean, we're going to be looking at churches in Paris, right by Saint-Denis, which you can see listed on your map. We're going to be looking at Chartres. We're going to be looking at Amiens, which is also in this same region. I'm going to focus primarily there as my target point. And you're going to see, I'll show you the development, what makes Gothic art Gothic, and then the development of the style from early to high Gothic. It begins here. I actually say that we can see the emergence of Gothic in a very, very specific time and place. It actually overlaps with Romanesque. Romanesque does not end when Gothic begins, but there are some new elements that will allow us to distinguish between one and the other. Our story begins here, which is in the Church of Saint-Denis, which is just outside of Paris. It's literally like a subway ride. You feel like you're still in Paris, really. And the Church of Saint-Denis was a very important church for the French. It was the French royal church. There were a lot of royal tombs there. It was a tradition for kings to be buried in Saint Denis. Saint Denis is actually, his name was Saint Dionysius. He was a 3rd century martyr saint, and he is the patron saint of France. So, the Church of Saint Denis, there had been an old church on this site from the early Middle Ages, and it was determined in the 12th century that the church should be rebuilt. The church at that time was under the rule of Abbot Suger. He was the head of the church. Very important man. He was actually a tutor to the French kings. He even served as regent when King Louis VII and his wife went off on the Crusades. So he actually ruled France briefly in their stead. In any case, he was responsible for rebuilding this church, which was considered like a national treasure. So he had a very difficult job in referencing the old church, but also advancing its style. The church was built over a period of years. He first built the western facade, then he began the eastern end, the apse and the ambulatory, and then finally, after his death, the nave was completed that connected the two. The eastern end was a particular challenge for Abbot Suger. The tomb of Saint Denis was in the crypt below the eastern end, and so there was an interest in keeping the same profile of the building. Abbot Suger actually wrote books about what he did, and we consider the ambulatory and the apse, the eastern end of this church, to be the first place that we see the emergence of Gothic. So, what makes this building Gothic? I'm going to give you my 2 big buzzwords for Gothic, and they are light and height. Okay, there's an interest in buildings becoming taller and taller, and an interest in making the interiors more flooded with light, and we're going to talk about what kind of light. Okay, so right now you're standing in the ambulatory, so you're looking into the eastern end of the building. You'll notice that it's a vaulted ceiling. The ambulatory. The vaults are being held up by these single sort of Corinthian-inspired columns. Remember that in Romanesque we saw a lot of compound piers. Traditionally in Gothic we also have compound piers, but the choice here was to have very simple columns because it referenced the earlier church that was on this site. But as we look up into the vaults, we see something new. I'll show you this. Let me just for 1 second step away and show you the plan. Here you can see on the right-hand side an entire plan of the church, but then specifically a blow-up on the left of what we're going to be focusing on. The first thing you're going to notice is what Abbot Suger creates is a very, very open interior space. Again, when you look at a floor plan and we talk about supports, we start looking for those large masses of wall that indicate the major support structure of the building. And you'll notice that the supports have gotten very minimal. There's not, those columns are not very thick, and yet they're holding up all of that ceiling and all of that vaulting. Even the outer walls, right, where you can see the absidal chapels or the radiating chapels, have not that big piers in between them. The walls are getting more and more perforated to allow a lot of light in. The supports of the building and the walls are sort of disappearing to allow for a much more open space. So when you look at this plan, there's not a clear separation between the choir and the apse and the ambulatory and the radiating chapels. All of it appears to be one unified interior space. And that's hard to do when you have to carry up the weight of the vaulting. So the idea of Gothic architecture really involves a change in the kind of engineering required so that you can have minimal supports to hold up taller and taller buildings. So how do we do it? The first thing you might notice when you look up into the vaulting, and first of all you have ribbed vaulting, and the ribs are incredibly pronounced. Gothic is really what you might consider to be a skeletal style, meaning we really see the bones of the building, which are the ribs are what hold everything up, and they're pronounced. You'll notice though that we've got the pointed arch. Okay, so remember in Romanesque we had round, sort of the perfect semicircular arch, and now we've got the pointed arch. All those arches come to a peak in the center. So why do we get that switch? That really is one of the hallmarks of Gothic style, and it may very well be a stylistic element that was borrowed from the builders coming into contact with Islamic architecture. But why the point? There are 2 real benefits to the pointed arch. The first is this. A pointed arch channels more of the weight down rather than out. Remember when we talked about the dome of Hagia Sophia, right, the Byzantine church, and I said the original dome was too shallow. It was too round in a sense, and so too much of the weight pushed out, and it dislocated the piers down below. The solution was to create a taller dome that pushed down rather than out. It's the same thing here. When you have a pointed arch, the weight is channeled more vertically than it would be in a perfect semicircular arch. The other issue is this. You'll notice that the spaces that are being vaulted here are quite complicated. The ambulatory is curving, which means you have a challenge of putting round arches over those spaces. Think of it this way. Consider the room that you're in right now, and you want to put a round, like a barrel vault on top of it, a round arch. That's fine, right? Now go into the next room, right, or go into the hallway, wherever the next room is, and look at this space. And let's say you want to put a round arch over that space as well. Those two arches are not likely to be the same height. A round arch, the height of an arch is predetermined by the width of the walls. If the walls are 10 feet apart, and it's a semicircular arch, it's going to be so high. If the walls are 4 feet apart, it's going to be lower. You see what I'm saying? You don't get to raise the arch to whatever height you want. A round arch is predetermined by the fact that it's a round arch. You see? So when you want to vault a very complicated space, a pointed arch means you can raise the peak of your arch to whatever height is desirable. So when you're vaulting really complicated spaces where, the width between the supports changes, pointed arches solve that problem, and you get a cohesive vault when you look up into the ceiling. So here you can see a little diagram, right? Here's a rectangular bay in this little drawing. So you'll notice that the space between the supports is wider in one direction than the other, and yet with the pointed arch you can raise the point to any height. Now, this diagram also shows you something else, which is it separates in the vault the ribs from the web. Now, the ribs are the major supporting element of the vaults, and we've seen ribbed vaults. We've already talked about transverse ribs and diagonal ribs when we looked at Romanesque. But take a look into the vault. Let's look into the ceiling. We're looking up. So now here you see these very, very pronounced ribs. The way that you would build an arch is as follows. You'd actually build scaffolding and put on it a wooden frame that was the shape of the arch you wanted to build. You would lay out the stones of the ribs, right, with mortar in between them, so they would fit this form, and you would allow them to dry for, I don't know, it could be 2-3 months, so you get a perfectly adhered ribs. Then you lay in what we call the webbing. The webbing is the infill, so in between those very pronounced round ribs, you see the flat surface of the vault. That's webbing. That webbing is non-supportive. It does not hold up the ceiling. It is simply a membrane that separates inside from outside. So if you think about it like a body, the ribs are the bones. They hold us up. The webbing is the skin, right? It's just a veneer. It's just a covering. So the idea in Gothic is to concentrate the supportive elements into those ribs as much as possible. Fill in the rest of the vault. That webbing is super, super thin, right, and lightweight, which allows you to build taller roofs on thinner supports because there's no real mass there. You see? So the goal is to make the buildings taller and to make everything weigh less so that you could support it without having big, chunky supports down below. They get more and more slender. It's a very elegant style, Gothic. The other thing you might have noticed looking into a view of the space was the addition of windows. Abbot Suger writes about what he called the lux nova, meaning the new light. Gothic buildings are about light. And when I say light, I don't mean brightness. Gothic churches are often very dark. I mean colored light. Meaning, Abbot Suger, when he wrote his books, championed the use of stained glass windows, which transform the interior with their light. But because of the style of his building, this skeletal style, where you have very minimal supports, more and more windows could be opened up through the walls. And as you can imagine, as walls disappear, Romanesque walls could be painted with biblical scenes. Stained glass windows become the primary source of images inside churches. And I'll show you what this does. So here's those two elements we're talking about, light and height. Now, the outside of Saint Denis, the western facade, doesn't survive, but it would have looked like this. This is a very other important, really what begins as an early Gothic, but ends up as a high Gothic church with a complicated story called Chartres Cathedral. Chartres Cathedral was originally begun right around the same time that Abbot Suger was modifying Saint Denis with this new Gothic style. And in fact, this building has elements of that new Gothic style. But the entire church burned down except for the west facade and the crypt in 1194. And so the rest of the building is rebuilt in what we would call a high Gothic style. So right now I'm showing you the western facade, which is in this early Gothic style. So the outside of Saint Denis would have looked like this. And I bring this up because you can still see the relationship to Romanesque. The outside looks, in a sense, like Saint Etienne, right? Like sort of like Norman Romanesque, meaning we've got these solid planes of walls with thick buttresses, right? You can see it has that same tripartite, three-part division of the facade. So you have a tower, then you have the entranceway, another tower, each one of them with three thick buttresses that support the mass of the wall. And because that supports the mass of the wall, the rest of the wall can be perforated, and you could see the addition of all of these windows, including this big circular window at the top of the facade, which is called a rose window. Very characteristic of Gothic art, and rose windows were often associated, because the rose was associated with the Virgin Mary. This flower-shaped sort of round window was associated with the Virgin Mary as well. And Chartres Cathedral was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. In fact, in terms of relics, Chartres Cathedral, because there's no bodily relics of the Virgin Mary, she was believed to be assumed into heaven, so taken up into heaven whole, so no body remains. They owned the relic. It was a piece of the Virgin Mary's tunic, the dress she was wearing when she gave birth to Christ. So that was their special relic. So very important pilgrimage site, which is why when it burns down, they need to rebuild quickly. But the reason I'm showing you the old-fashioned facade is that I want to show you the portal decoration so that you can see what portal decoration has done. We looked at two examples of a Romanesque portal, and now I want to show you the early Gothic evolution of that idea. This is called the royal portal because it was decorated with images of kings and queens, which were considered to be the royal ancestors of Christ. This is an important idea. Saint Denis also had a Western royal portal. Saint Denis was the burial place of kings, and so its exterior was decorated with the same idea, the royal ancestors of Christ that are written about in the Old Testament. So they're Old Testament figures. The royal portals were often destroyed during the French Revolution, which is why we don't have the portals for Saint Denis, but we have them at Chartres. Okay, so why am I showing you this? The point that I want to make here is that the idea of the portal, right, portal decoration, that this becomes the focal point of your sculptural decoration for these churches. We looked at single portals when we looked at Romanesque. They become very elaborate, and we get entire what you would call a program of decoration. Chartres Cathedral is a three-aisled church. Therefore, it has three major portals that are decorated on the exterior. These portals were planned by theologians, right? Artists didn't just set about sculpting what they wanted to carve. Learned scholars planned the programs, right? And they planned out all the meaning and symbolism of them. Some of them contain symbols you wouldn't expect to see on Gothic churches. There are the symbols, for example, in the archivolts, I think, of the right-hand portal, of the 7 liberal arts. In other words, the 7 categories of modern scholastic learning. Here included on a religious portal. So you get a period of what's called scholasticism, where the study of ancient philosophy and ancient ideas and the pursuit of knowledge are all given Christian meaning. So you get the incorporation of different ideas into a Christian context, and they're very elaborate. So You may also notice there's number symbolism involved here as well. You'll see certain numbers repeated in Christian decoration. 3s, 4s, 7s, especially. 3 is obviously very important, and there's 3 portals here. 3 is the number for the Trinity, which is the 3 gods in one, the God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which is very central to Christian thought. 4s, also quite important. 4s are actually very often associated with earthly things, like 4 times of day and 4 seasons. But there's also the 4 evangelists, which you see very prominent in the central tympanum here. 3 times 4 equals 12, which are the numbers of the apostles. And actually, if you look on the lintel of the central tympanum, you'll see the apostles grouped in 4 groups of 3. 3 plus 4 equals 7, and there are things associated with 7. There's what's called the 7 sorrows of the Virgin. There's also the 7 liberal arts. There are the 7 deadly sins. So 7s too become a number that get considered. So a lot of these elements that are shown here are shown with these 3s and 4s. Okay, this shows you a portal decoration. The central portal is still about the second coming, which is a theme that we saw in Romanesque. Here, and sometimes in Gothic, it's done in a less scary way. This is more positive and less negative, where we just see Christ again seated on the central axis in his mandorla, surrounded by the 4 symbols of the evangelists and the 12 apostles down below. You'll notice a little bit higher relief. We start to see in Gothic some of the architectural sculpture sort of begin to get loose from the building, meaning in Romanesques it's often very, very flat. Think of the Trumeau figure that we looked at, of Jeremiah, who was so flat he was stuck to his pier. He's practically two-dimensional. Here, we still don't have a lot of freestanding sculpture in the round, but the sculptures are starting to become higher and higher relief. And you can even see that in the tympanum up above, but undoubtedly these would have been painted. The right-hand portal that you're looking at, right, which is actually, I guess, oh boy, now I'm very bad with directions. It's the south portal, is dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary becomes increasingly important during the Gothic era. We already saw that in Romanesque and even in later Byzantine. So there's an image of Mary with baby Christ, so that portal is dedicated to Mary's life. And then on the north portal, which is Christ's right, is actually another scene of Christ, showing the ascension of Christ, Christ being bodily assumed into heaven. So 2 portals dedicated to Christ, 1 portal dedicated to Mary. Interestingly enough, if you look at the doors down below, you'll notice very pronounced jam figures, which are those figures of Old Testament kings and queens, the royal ancestors of Christ, which would relate this building to the royal family of France. And the capitals above each of those columns are historiated capitals that tell the story of the life of Christ, reading from left to right in a continuous frieze. So they connect the 3 portals together. So you can see just how elaborate the program is. By the way, I say these would have been painted, but it's a west portal, which means it would get direct sunlight for at least a portion of the day. And you can see that here, right, that in full sunlight, these high relief forms, like the metopes outside the Parthenon, would be quite a bit more legible. And this picture's also nice because you get a sense of scale. So all of these figures, even the jam figures, which are the royal ancestors of Christ, so they're closest to us because they may or may not be sainted figures. They're usually not. They're mostly Old Testament, even though they have halos. They are human, and therefore they're closer to us than the figures, obviously, of Christ up above or of Mary, his mother. And here's a better view of these jam figures. You can see the historiated capitals up above. You can see just how much of the surface is decorated, including the columns and the spaces in between them. The columns themselves, when I say that the figures are gaining independence, you can really see that in the jam figures. We see these high relief columns behind the figures, even though they're still engaged columns. But the figures themselves are high relief figures attached to the columns. The proportions are still related to Romanesque proportions, those very elongated proportions. We don't see much of the body beneath the draperies. They're certainly not contrapposto. And we have the small heads and stretched out forms. And yet, The figures are beginning to gain personalities. Some of them turn in each other's direction on some Gothic buildings. These are still early and are a little bit isolated. But they begin to get character. The figures have different proportions, they have different shapes, they have different facial types, different facial hair. So we're getting the sense of that these become their own individual, unique studies as opposed to just being generic types. And again, when you see these, you should think of back to the Caryatid. So like Jeremiah, we're not quite there. We're engaged columns, but these figures are becoming more freestanding. Those are high-relief sculptures that you're beginning to be able to get your hands around a little bit, which relates a little bit more to the tradition of the Caryatid, even though these figures that we see on the Gothic portal are still not structural the way a Caryatid is. But Gothic, as I said, is about light and height, which means over time, and this is a chronological illustration of some of the most important Gothic structures, over time the buildings become taller and taller. The aspiration is towards a building that really, Saint Denis referred to a cathedral as being the way station between heaven and earth. So there really is this aspiration in the height of a building to become closer to God. It's a different idea, but not totally unlike what we've seen in the past. The Sumerians built, temple platforms, right? Think back to the idea of the ziggurat. The Greeks put their temples on hilltops to be closer to the gods. Here, the Gothic church tends to be in the middle of a city. It's an urban setting, but it dominates the setting. It rises above its landscape in an effort to reach God. And so you can see that in this idea that over time the buildings get taller and taller. And they also get lighter and lighter. So increasingly, the wall surface is going to disappear and get replaced with windows. So again, the engineering has to change in order to accommodate a taller building with fewer supports and more windows. So, for example, I'm going to show you Chartres, which is the second image from your left, where we have 120-foot high walls up until the springing of the vaults. When we get to Amiens, which is the last church, almost last, I'll show you, we're going to have 144 feet. So you'll see that, but you also see the effect of height changing. These buildings appear incredibly vertical. Horizontal lines begin to disappear, and our eye just soars upwards from the compound piers all the way up the engaged colonnettes up to the vault. So those arches become more pointed. Everything becomes emphatically vertical. When we talk about a building, we'll talk about its elevation. And I mentioned this when we talk about Romanesque. If I say what is the elevation of the building, I don't mean how tall is the building. I mean what are the stories or the levels of the height of the building. So these buildings are usually three-part elevations. The lowest story is called the nave arcade, right, which is where you just see those arches connecting one compound pier to the next. The second story, in a Romanesque building, the second story would have been the gallery. The gallery, remember, was a second story where you could have the overflow of worshippers. In Gothic, it gets replaced with what's called a triforium, which is really a non-space. It looks like a little corridor or a passageway, but really it's just hiding the space where the roof of the side aisles is. It's just like a dead space. It's a thin, narrow band. The top is the clerestory, which becomes more and more important because that's where your windows are. So the clerestory gets bigger and bigger in proportion to the rest of the space. Look at the height of the clerestory at the first building versus the height of the clerestory in the last one. These are, by the way, what are called lancet windows, which become very popular in Gothic, which are pointed windows, right? They're sort of rectangular at the base, but they come to a peak at the top. So now this is Chartres Cathedral from the air. We just looked at the western part of the building, which was early Gothic, but the rest of Chartres Cathedral is built really in the 1200s, and it is in a high Gothic style. So the building itself, from the air, from God's eye view, you see that cruciform shape. It's a cross, literally seen from God. That's an idea because you get the nave that crosses the transept, but that cross shape really becomes symbolic at this point. Buildings aspire to be cross shape. Most buildings have very tall elements, either a crossing spire, like a tower over the crossing. There's not one here. But you will have bell towers on the facade, and you could see how tall they are. Those two bell towers on the front, on the western facade, were built at different times, and you could see that that interest in height means the spires get taller, even if they don't match. You can see the skeletal aspect of the building from this point of view, in that there's not a lot of walls, and you see more and more windows, especially here you can see that clerestory level. Let's take a look at a diagram. So here's the diagram. And this is good because this labels all the parts of the building for you. There are parts of these buildings that you should recognize. You already know these parts. The choir, the apse, apsidal chapels or radiating chapels. The crossing, right, a nave and a transept. And the facade, there you can see the portals and the jambs labeled. There's the rose window up above, lancet windows. You can see the levels of the building marked, the clerestory, the triforium. There is something here that's new. And you could see it both on the earlier picture I just showed you, but also here. The walls are getting taller and thinner, and they need something else to support them, especially at the top in between those clerestory windows. Traditionally, when walls need support, you add buttresses, and buttresses are thick piers that attach to the wall on the outside that help support the weight. We saw buttresses at Hagia Sophia. We saw buttresses not only on the facade of Chartres, but we saw buttresses on the facade of Saint-Étienne when we looked at Romanesque. Here, if you look at the diagram where the wall is cut away, you'll see buttress piers, big thick supports. The problem is you can't run those supports, or you don't want to in Gothic, run those supports all the way up the side of the building because they would interfere with your clerestory windows. And so you get the addition of what's called a flying buttress. And that means that at the base the buttress is a pier, but at the top it's a brace that holds up the top of the wall with a thin bar placed in between the windows. I'll show you the flying buttress from the exterior. Those are flying buttresses. So here's you can see the buttress pier, and then at the top it literally has what's called a flyer, which is the arm, that little brace that comes out and holds up the space in between the windows. So that top wall can be a membrane, very thin, no supportive function, and that brace comes back and helps support the structure without forcing there to be less light and fewer windows. Flying buttresses really are one of the key features of Gothic, the pointed arch and the flying buttress. Together they allow for greater light and greater height. So those are your goals, and those are the mechanisms that achieve it, the flying buttress and the pointed arch. I'll show you, we'll learn a little bit more. I'm actually going to have you watch a video or two that'll show you a little bit more about flying buttresses, but this gives you an idea of what they look like. Flying buttresses, by the way, you can think of them as exterior permanent scaffolding. Now here's the plan of Chartres Cathedral, and you see again the supports of the building get thinner and thinner and thinner. You can see the base, by the way, along the side of the side aisles, right? In the nave, you can see those big, heavy buttress piers, right? Those are very important. But because they're there, it allows the compound piers of the nave to be slender. The crossing piers aren't even that thick. These buildings, just so you know, they are built according to a tremendous sense of geometry. You'll also see that in the video. But there are geometric relationships from every part of the building to every other. In a simple way, you might notice that the rectangular bays of the nave are twice the side aisle bays. In other words, you have simple relationships, but the height of the building are determined by geometry. The idea, usually the architect starts with the crossing as the major geometric element, and then every other measurement of the building is determined from that crossing. There's the idea that the perfection of geometry relates to the perfection of God. By the way, in Gothic, first of all, we don't usually have an alternate support system. The compound piers are going to be identical. And we tend to have quadripartite or four-part vaults rather than the six-partite or sexpartite vaults that we saw sometimes used in Romanesque. Quadripartite vaults were easier to support, and so it made for thinner supports down below. Oh, and here's the interior of Chartres. Okay, so you see what I mean by verticality. Those identical compound piers almost makes it look like a funnel. Your eye in this building is supposed to be drawn two places. One towards the eastern end, where the altar is, right, which is most symbolic part of the church. That's where the altar is, that's where the relics are. There'll be the most light will be in the eastern end of the church, so it'll pull your eye. And when you look towards it, you see how you almost just get at the end, when you get close to the eastern end, those vertical elements of the compound piers just become, they all blend together, and it becomes this like funnel of space. Your eye also goes up. If you follow those compound piers at the base, you'll notice these engaged colonnettes which just go continuously up, practically uninterrupted by any horizontal element, and they bring your eye all the way up right into those pronounced ribs of the vaulting up above. You see, so your eye soars in a Gothic building, 120 feet. So look how small those chairs are, just for a sense of scale of the space. This is a 3-story elevation. Again, lower story is your nave arcade, which just separates the nave from the side aisles. The second story is that triforium, which is just that dead space that hides the side aisle roofs. The third story is the clerestory, which is getting bigger and bigger with larger windows. This is a great example to also show you about Gothic windows, because in a lot of Gothic churches, the original stained glass windows which were used don't survive, and over time they get replaced with clear glass because people like light-flooded interiors of churches. Gothic churches are about light, but not brightness. They're not light interiors, but there's a lot of light. Stained glass windows, the lux nova that Abbot Suger wrote about, was the fact that the light that comes in through a stained glass window, it shines colored, jewel-toned light into the interior. So the interior becomes this otherworldly space. It transforms the light of nature into something divine and otherworldly. The interior space doesn't feel like the world outside, and it shines on the architecture and makes it almost disappear. I'll show you the effects best I can. But on a practical term, stained glass windows were important because as you have fewer wall surfaces, they become your primary source of decoration on the interior. So stained glass windows are used to tell Bible stories, to show images of saints and holy images. They had to be very readable from a distance, so they become a little bit of a challenge. But Chartres is remarkable because a lot of its original stained glass window actually survives, so you can really see what the effect of the building is. I mean, it's sort of a remarkable thing. And here's an example of the windows. You know, windows were described by theologians of the time as they relate to the scriptures, right? A window lets in the light, but it protects you from the elements. So, like the scriptures, it keeps out harmful things, right? It keeps out sin. But like a window keeps out rain and wind, but it lets the light, the goodness, the holiness shine through. The Virgin Mary was also referred to as a glass vessel because of her virginity, right? That light passes through but doesn't break it. So light becomes symbolic of God, of holiness, the colored light of this divine holiness. Here's an example of one of these early windows. A rose window, which I've already mentioned. So that upper circular window is a rose window. That window is 42 feet in diameter, so it's enormous. And the lancet, those pointed windows down below. Windows look colored glass. They knew how to make colored glass since ancient Egyptian times. There was a method it's originally made from sand and minerals and melted. But the idea, I mean, it was a very elaborate idea to make a stained glass window. One artist would come in, presumably, and design the window, make the drawings. Those drawings had to be passed over to a glazier who made the glass and would cut the pieces of colored glass to fit the drawing. Early on in Gothic, you get very simple colors, but over time, artists begin to use the process of flashing, where you would adhere two different colored glasses together to create new colors, like flashing red and blue to create purple glass. So you could flash colors. Okay, then you would take these cut pieces of glass, and they had to be fit together with thin strips of lead to fit the pieces together, which would then usually be fit into iron frames, and then all of this would be fit into these holes in the building, right? The stone frame for it is called tracery, right? So you have this, it's where it's black in your picture, right? There's the stone frame, and the colored glasses fit in. Early Romanesque uses what's called plate tracery, which is much more substantial. Then you get bar tracery. The tracery itself gets more slender. So this is an example. I mean, Chartres has these 22,000 square feet of stained glass windows that survive. So in any case, these windows take on their own elaborate meaning. This was a window that was actually donated to the church, we think, by Blanche of Castile, who was the king's mother. And so the subject is on royalty. The lancet windows down below all show the royal ancestors of Christ, which is a theme that we've seen before. The central lancet actually shows St. Anne, which is Mary's mother, holding baby Mary. And then if you move up into the rose window, the center of the rose window, which you realize that that's a 40-foot, 2-foot in diameter window, those are life-size figures in the center, I'm sure, is the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus. So you get 3 generations, St. Anne and Mary below, and then Mary and infant Jesus above on the central axis. And then surrounded by a host of other images, by the doves of the Holy Spirits and angels radiating outward, by images of prophets and Old Testament kings in the diamonds. And then there's a lot of iconography that references that this is probably for Blanche of Castile. You'll notice decoration that's blue ground with yellow 3-lobed flowers called a fleur de lis, which is a French symbol. Which suggests this was for French royalty. And then you'll also notice where there's a red background with yellow castles on it, which was a symbol for Castile, where Blanche was from. So there's personal iconography, there's also then religious iconography. And these scenes, especially those lancet down below, had to be readable from the ground. So you'll see the bright colors, the simplified line, and the oversized figures so that they are legible. But that's the effect of stained glass, you see? So it's not about a bright interior. Gothic cathedrals were dark, but the light shines through, and it shines colored light on the architecture, and it makes the stone seem to disappear in this bath of color. It really is a mystical thing that they were going for. Now, over time, Gothic goes for more light and more height. So I'm only going to introduce this building quickly. I expect there are going to be videos posted that I'd like you to watch on it that are really fascinating and fun, kind of. This is the Church of Amiens. Amiens is a high Gothic building, and it's the tallest of the ones that we've seen, where the walls, before you get to the springing of the vaults, are 144 feet, so tremendously tall. And you'll notice that the building gets more and more perforated. So now here, looking at the facade, it's a 3-aisled church. We've got 3 portals. The decoration of the portals and all of these perforations on the facade of windows and openings, again, dissolve the wall. It's very hard, even looking at the facade, to find the buttresses and the wall in the building. The rose window has very slender tracery. The bell towers on the left and the right are perforated. You can see sky through them. So again, it's all about lightening the walls and achieving greater height. Amiens Cathedral was built beginning in 1220 because the earlier church had been burned down. And so a new church gets put up incredibly quickly. The majority of the building was put up actually by 69. You have slightly different dates here. But 1269, the most of it's put up. Look, they did that by taxing the heck out of people. You know, when Chartres burned down and they had to rebuild the church, they did it by imposing massive taxes. They did some of it with donation from the clergy, but then they imposed such tremendous taxes on the town people that the bishop and the clergy were run out of Chartres for 4 years. So, I mean, these were incredibly expensive buildings, especially to put them up with such speed. 3 architects work on the project. First, Robert of Lussarche, then it's continued by his assistant, Thomas of Cormont, and then by his son, Renaud of Cormont. And you'll hear about them in the videos. Oh, Chartres had the tunic of the Virgin. Amiens has the head of St. John the Baptist. And here you can see the relic. Although I have to warn you, I know of at least 4 heads of St. John the Baptist. In other words, some of these relics aren't necessarily authentic, but there's their great relic. Just to show you little snippets of the decoration that I thought you'd get a kick out of. It's a 3-portal design. The central portal is dedicated to Last Judgment, which we've seen before. That's quite traditional. One portal is dedicated to the Virgin Mary, like we saw at Chartres. The other one to a saint called Saint Firmin, who was a local saint that was of importance to them. They've got jam figures of saints and apostles. And then down below the jam, they had things on the architecture that even more related to humankind. So here you'll notice these are called quatrefoils, these 4-lobe designs. And the lowest level, you could see they're within the reach of humankind. The quatrefoils have things that relate to mankind. Here you can see the same idea of the zodiac signs and the labors of the months that we already saw in Romanesque architecture. So you might recognize Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, Taurus, and Gemini, and below them the activities that took place outside in nature of those times of year. So beneath the holy registers up above, we see the passage of time and man's activities. Some of the quatrefoils show things like virtues and vices in 2 registers, and of course the vices are lower down and within your reach. The virtues you aspire to, they're over your head. I just thought you'd get a kick out of this, especially if you're a Monty Python fan. As you see the knight with his sword, dropping his sword in fear and turning to run away from the rabbit that approaches him. And this is to illustrate the vice of cowardice. The central tympanum shows a familiar subject, which is the Last Judgment. Again, you usually get Christ appearing at the end of time, the second coming, or judgment. This is the scary Last Judgment version, which we've also seen. Gislibertus's falls into this category. Same thing. You could do this by now. Tympanum, 3 registers, again, to deal with the awkward shape of the tympanum. Here you have much higher relief, because again, Gothic, the architecture gets a little bit more independent. Christ on the central axis. In the heavenly realm up above, notice Mary to his right, praying on our behalf. The second story, which here is the division between the saved and the damned. The lowest story, where on the central axis we see the weighing of souls, which we also saw in Gislibertus's example, and then the resurrection of people from the dead. It's familiar stuff. The reason I'm showing it to you is that these images used to be painted, and you can actually see the traces of paint on this. Also something quite spectacular. As I had mentioned for the column of Trajan, there had been an experiment where laser lights were used to recolor the sculpture of Amiens facade. So I can show you through those photographs what we believe the color of the building originally to have looked like. A little bit blurry, and it's a nighttime shot. But this is meant to give you some indication based on pigment samples of what the facade would have looked like. So you truly were supposed to be entering into this glorious heavenly realm. You'll notice on the trumeau down below is the central figure of the blessing Christ. So you get the Christ damning and saving up above. The Christ down below blesses he who enters into the church. And just some details. Right, so here are the images of the clothed saved. Notice the saved people are clothed, right? The body associated with sin. Where you see St. Peter letting people come into the space of heaven as they're being crowned by angels up above. Notice that heaven is a Gothic church. So again, the analogy is very specific that you go to church in order to be saved. On the other side, Christ's left, right, the lesser side, you see angels brandishing swords and demons pushing the nude sinners, some with money bags around their necks, into the giant hell mouth. By the way, nobody is safe. Notice among the sinners we've got kings, we've got bishops and clergy, men and women. So nobody is safe from God's judgment. And down below you see people rising from their tombs, praying. You see the angels blowing their horns of judgment. All of this interspersed with grapevines, right? There's symbolism we've seen from early Christian times. And at the very center, you see St. Michael again, weighing the souls, comparing the sheep, again, another symbol we've seen since early Christian times, which is the good soul from the demonic head, which is the bad. From down below it would look like this, so the high relief would make the forms legible. The interior of Amiens, you really get that sense of height, right? More emphatically even than at Chartres. This, by the way, is an example of a bad use of stained glass. The stained glass of Amiens has mostly been destroyed, and it's been replaced by clear glass. So here it's like, oh, bright interior, but that wouldn't have been the effect. Here you can see again, very high, three-part elevation, very high nave arcade, the triforium, and the very large clerestory up above. The pronounced quadripartite ribs, the compound piers with engaged columns, very minimal horizontal elements, and the use of light and architecture to guide your eyes in two ways. Once towards the high altar and the eastern end of the church, and the other up towards the heavens. The interest in light and height you can see the culmination of it here. And this is the last thing I'm going to show you, which is really not a church. It's not that big of a church or that tall of a church, but when I say height, I sort of mean in proportion. This is a structure called the Sainte-Chapelle. Right? It's a holy chapel, and it was attached to the French palace, and it was built by Louis IX, who becomes Saint Louis, right? King Louis, who becomes later sainted 27 years after his death. This is really the Gothic taken to the extreme. We call this style the rayonnant style, which is the radiant style, literally because of this extreme examples of increased windows. Here you'll notice the windows, those lancet windows, are 49 feet high, and 75% of the building, of the wall surface, is replaced by windows. So here you see the absolute dissolution of the walls, and all you have are slender piers and very slender bars in between the windows. So the walls themselves are gone, replaced entirely with glass. Sainte-Chapelle was built, actually, you'll notice it's all covered with gold and glass and color. It looks like a giant reliquary box. And in fact, that's what it was. It was built because the king had gotten some relics associated with the Passion of Christ, including the crown of thorns, from his cousin, who was the ruler of Constantinople following one of the Crusades. And so he builds this as literally a giant reliquary box to house these relics. That he had a piece of the true cross, and all of the windows would tell the stories of those relics and of Christ. This is, by the way, what we just call the upper chapel. Sainte-Chapelle is a chapel in 2 stories. The lower is actually a 3-aisled, like a miniature church, and the upper story is this reliquary housing. So this becomes really the culmination of what we mean by height, this sense of verticality, and light, through the use of this transformative stained glass that make up Gothic and High Gothic art.